Welcome to all the audience. The last few days have been very eventful for observers of the economy. First, we had on November 28th the release of the GDP growth figures for the second quarter of the current financial year, that is the July to September quarter. And this showed a growth rate in real terms of 8.2%, which was much higher than anticipated, much higher than all the projections, and also the highest in a year and a half. So that beat all expectations. And soon afterwards, we had the paradoxical figure coming out from the industrial growth estimates for the month of October, which is not exactly coinciding with the GDP estimates, but nevertheless, it shows that there's been some kind of a sharp discontinuity, and that showed that industrial growth had only increased by 0.3%, which is the lowest in many, many years. So there are these kind of contrary trends emerging, and all this happens under the shadow of an exercise by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, based in Washington, D.C., which is a kind of watchdog and oversight body for international financial flows, and kind of monitors and surveils economies worldwide. And they found that India's GDP statistics were not fit for purpose. They found that it needed to go a long way before it served the purpose for which it was intended, which is IMF surveillance. Now, that also implies evidently that it's not fit for purpose in terms of Indian policy making. So we have here with us Professor Arun Kumar, an eminent economist and prolific author and commentator, who's worked for long years on issues like this and on the parallel economy and such other topics. And he was till recently a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and continues to be a keen observer and commentator. So we'll start with posing to him this question of what he makes out of these recent events, and where does he see the economy right now, and where does he see things going?
So thank you for having me. The first point that I think I'd like to make is reliability of data. Because if data is not reliable, then saying we are fastest growing economy, 8.2% growth, that doesn't sound very credible at that point. And as you rightly said, if you look at the other data, that data is not so good, like for instance, unemployment, people complain of a lot of unemployment. If an economy is growing at 7%, 8%, it should generate enough employment. And in India, 94% are in the unorganized sector, only 6% are in the organized sector. If the unorganized sector is growing at anything like 7, 8%, it would generate a lot of employment. Then this problem of unemployment, etc., would not be there. Second, the recent data seems to suggest that a lot of investment projects have stalled or have been withdrawn. That also suggests
infrastructure projects. Yeah, are you referring to infrastructure projects?
In the aggregate, one of the newspapers carried this news that many of the projects that were supposed to be taken up, they have now stalled or they have not been taken up. That FDI has turned negative, net FDI. So more FDI is going out than is coming in. That also indicates that there is something not really right. So all this seems to suggest, in terms of the field, that things are not okay. And in that context, the IMF is very significant. I would say that even though they have come late to this assessment, it has been there. But it's better to be late than never.
Correct. The IMF only began this process some 2 years back.
Yes. But the point is, last year also it was grade C.
Oh, okay.
This year also it's grade C. But this year, because the Hindu picked it up, so I think it's come up in a big way. Last year it didn't get picked up. Now, what they're saying is that the data is dated, the data has problems. So they have listed out, for instance, that we're still using the 2011-12 base data series, whereas we should have changed that. That's also true of Consumer Price Index, CPI, that we're using the 2011-12 base. Then they also point out that how discrepancies in the data have been large between the the expenditure side and the production side. Then they also pointed out that aggregate data for the states and the local bodies was last given in 2019 and not after that. So they're pointing out a lot of gaps. Then this idea that we should have double deflation of the figures whereas we are doing a single deflation with not producer prices but wholesale prices.
Could you explain that aspect, please? Because I think this might be
So
it requires some unpacking for our
viewers. What happens is that when we are looking at the economy and trying to measure what is the GDP, we are looking at what is the output minus the input. That's called the value addition. So if we count the entire output, there'll be double counting because we'll be counting the input again.
Right.
So therefore, we need to calculate the value addition, which is output minus the input, right? Now, output prices may be different, input prices may be different. If we deflate by the same price, then there'd be an error in there. Right? So therefore, we need to deflate them by two different prices. The input prices and the out prices separately. So, otherwise, there'll be cyclicity, there'll be some other problems that people point to. There's rather technical things, but nonetheless, we should do that,
So there are severe problems with price data. Apart from the production estimates, there are severe problems with the price data too.
Price data and the manner in which you deflate the GDP. Because that's how you come to the real, because the GDP is measuring the real increase plus the price increase.
Correct.
And we are interested in the real increase. So we have to remove the price increase.
So on that point, the nominal rate of growth for the last quarter, July-September quarter, is 8.7%. And the real rate of growth is 8.2%. There's a difference of just 0.5 percentage points, which is anomalous because in earlier quarters, there's been at least a 3 to 4% point.
But
difference.
I don't.
So is the price data also completely
Look, price data, they have already flagged that we are using the earlier consumer price index and we are using the wholesale price index rather than the producer price index. And in India, we don't have a producer price index.
Right.
So therefore, that makes a difference. But to me, that's less important than the fact that actually there is something behind all this which is not flagged by the IMF, which is that the GDP series of 2011-12 itself was controversial.
Right.
When the 2011-12 GDP series came, it came in 2015 when the NDA was in power already. And they did not like the initial thing. So they said there's no back series. They only gave the figure for post 2011-12. People said, how do we compare whether this series is okay or the earlier data was okay? So have to give the back series also. They said, no, the MCA 21 database which was used was not stabilized, etc., etc. So we couldn't go before that. But people still objected to that. So they set up
this is the Ministry of Company Affairs, MCA.
Yes, MCA 21 is the company affairs.
Company affairs, which they used for estimating the formal sector.
Now they do it. Prior to 2011-12, it wasn't used. The MCA 21 database wasn't used. So this was new innovation, as so to say in the 2011-12 new series, that they are now using the broader MCA 21 database. But then the MCA 21 database itself had a problem, and I'm going to come to that. So the first cut was that they didn't give the back series. The second thing is they set up a committee. The committee then calculated a back series. But they didn't like it because it showed that during UPA, there's a higher growth rate than during NDA.
Right.
So they rejected it. They didn't accept it. Then they asked Niti Aayog to look at it. Now, Niti Aayog is not a statistical organization. It's a statistical organization which should have done it. But Niti Aayog then actually gave the new series. That showed that during the NDA years, the rate of growth is higher than during the UPA years. Okay. So they accepted it. But soon thereafter, the former chief economic advisor, Mr. Subramaniam, he came out with a figure using some econometric analysis that it was overestimating GDP by 2.5 to 3%. Okay, so therefore,
percentage points.
Okay, so it was
when it shows us 8% is actually
less by
5.5 to 6.
Right. So it was less by at least 2.5 to 3%. Okay, so that didn't go well with them. And then soon after that, during demonetization, they said there are a lot of shell companies. So 3 lakh shell companies were removed out of the 18 lakh companies in the MCA 21 database. Okay. Now, if you remove 3 lakh out of 18 lakh, that's 1/6. It should make a difference to GDP. It should make that, the contribution of these 3 lakh companies should go out. But nothing happened. The GDP figures remained the same. Soon thereafter, further problem came up. They found 35% of the companies in the sample were not where they said the address was or were not doing what they were doing. So therefore, the database was terrible. Okay. And therefore, the problem was with the GDP itself.
And this was entirely introduced in the 2011-12 series.
This was all for the 2011-12 series.
Okay.
But the point
prior to that, they had a different way of estimating.
Different way of estimating, right? Different database to estimate it. So the point is not only what the IMF is saying, these are lacuna of using 2011-12, etc., but the 2011-12 series itself was under question.
Correct.
And it did not take into account the black economy at all, which is something that I've been pointing out for quite a long time, that this official data doesn't take into account the black economy.
Yeah, but
which
black
is very substantial.
Does not feature in GDP estimates in any case, right? I mean, that's why it's called the parallel economy.
No, so it's not, in India, it's not parallel like in the West, where it's illegal and legal, etc. But in India, it's very much intertwined.
Right.
So the black economy has an effect on the white economy.
There are linkages at the very
completely interlinked. It's done through under-invoicing, over-invoicing. So suppose you're producing, say, cement, and 20% of the cement is not declared. That means 20% of the production of cement is not counted.
Correct.
Right? So therefore, it affects the white economy data also. Okay. So the point is that all these things are going on, and on top of that, it's happening. Now, what it suggests is that the government has been manipulating the GDP series. It accepted the series when it showed that during the NDA it was higher than in the UPA. Now, it's not only the GDP series that the manipulation was taking place. You know that in 2017-18, the consumption survey, that data was not given out because it said it was not acceptable because it was showing lower consumption figures. Then in 2019, the estimate of unemployment, which was at record high of 45 years, that got leaked out, but that was not accepted and declared only after the election.
Correct.
So what all this is suggesting is that the government has been manipulating the data.
So all through these years, when there was a recorded drop in consumption, or at least a very sluggish growth rate, and also when there was a rise in unemployment, 2017 to 19, the growth rates continue to be high. So that's an anomalous situation.
No, so my take on that is that that's the other thing we need to point to, because the IMF has also first time flagged the fact that the informal sector data is not properly measured. Right. And the reason is that, you see, when you look at the GDP estimation method, what does it do? It says that for quarterly data, we don't have much of the unorganized sector data. Not only much of the even though much of the organized sector data is not there. So what is done is benchmark is taken, and then these are inflated using high frequency indicators. Okay. Right. But the benchmark itself changes, then there's a shock to the economy. So for instance, demonetization affected the unorganized sector hugely, but much less the organized sector. So the ratio between the organized and the unorganized sector that is used, that is not what it was in the benchmark year of 2015.
When then the COVID pandemic also shifted.
That's the first shock. And therefore, that shows in the data itself, because the government said that during the demonetization year, the rate of growth was 8% plus. Whereas everybody knew that in the month of November, December, January, February, March, the output had declined, the markets were empty, the unemployment was higher, stocks with the industry was higher. So it could not be. So my estimate was that for that year, the rate of growth, because for 5 months there was negative growth, the rate of growth had become minus 2%, but it was being shown as 8%. Mm-hmm. And why is that? Because you are proxying the unorganized sector with the organized sector. You don't have data for the unorganized sector except for agriculture, but for the rest, you're proxying the unorganized sector with the organized sector. Now, unorganized sector declined, organized sector was rising, so you got a high growth rate. Now, the next year came the GST.
Right.
Now, GST again damaged the unorganized sector, even though the unorganized sector is kept out of GST. But what happens is that if you are outside the GST network, you don't get input credit. So your price doesn't drop. Mm-hmm. The organized sector gets input credit. So its price drops. Okay. So in competition, the organized sector market expands, the unorganized sector market declines. So the growth of the organized sector is at the expense of the unorganized sector. Okay. And then the next year came the NBFC crisis in 2018. Again, that damaged the unorganized sector much more than the organized sector. And then, as you rightly said, pandemic came in 2020. And here the effect was huge. Large number of people migrated from the cities to the villages, and in such terrible conditions with the heat and the children, children on their shoulders and dragging their luggage, etc. No other economy had that. So the unorganized sector again got damaged, and people moved from cities to the villages, and they still haven't come back. And that's why your labor in the rural areas in agriculture has gone up from 44 to 46%. Okay, whereas till then the amount of percentage of labor in the agriculture sector is declining.
Right.
So this rose because it didn't revive. So what I'm pointing out is the unorganized sector being measured by the organized sector, which is a faulty thing.
It's a spurious process.
Yes,
Yeah.
because a declining sectors being shown as rising sector.
Correct.
And to give an example, look at the trade sector. Trade sector is the second biggest employer in the country after agriculture, right? Now, in the trade sector, e-commerce is growing at 20, 30, 40%. And that's organized sector, and that's highly mechanized. And the neighborhood stores, which are the unorganized sector, they are declining as a result. So, people have shifted from going to neighborhood stores to e-commerce and to malls and so on.
E-commerce were all the labor inputs of the unorganized sector, like the delivery executives and so on. Would that be counted within the organized sector output, or would that be...
No, that labor is unorganized.
Unorganized.
Okay, but the organized sector is rising.
Right.
Okay, so a lot of the organized sector employs unorganized sector, like take Maruti. A lot of people are now contract
They use
workers,
a lot of subcontracting.
Subcontracting and so on. So the workers remain unorganized even though they are working in the organized sector, right? So my point is that this e-commerce and malls are highly automated.
Right.
And mechanized, whereas the neighborhood store is labor intensive, right?
Yes, yeah.
So therefore the employment declines. Similarly, you see it in many other sectors. The report is, say, from your say leather goods sector, it's from the pressure cooker sector, it's from the luggage industry, it's from FMCG. That the organized sector is growing at the expense of the unorganized sector.
Right.
So the faster the growth of the organized sector, the faster the decline of the unorganized sector. So in one of my articles, I showed that the unorganized sector has been declining at between 5% and 9%. So what is being shown as growing at 6.5% is actually declining. So there's 11.5% purchase there, So the data is off by 11.5% for the unorganized sector.
Correct.
So the unorganized sector, non-agriculture, is about 30%. So if that's off by at least 10, 12%, then it means that 3 to 4% is being overestimated. So
Okay.
instead of 7.5%, your economy is going at maybe 2.5, 3%.
2.5, 3%. Yeah, you've emphasized a lot on the informal sector, the unorganized sector. Now, I think this has been the blind side of policy making.
Yeah.
In 2007 to 2009, you had the National Commission for Employment in the Unorganized Sector,
Right.
NEUS,
Yes.
which estimated that about 92% of the total workforce was in the informal sector. And since then, we've had the removal of all the protection.
Yeah.
Probably, you had
Correct.
the reverse migration of the COVID pandemic years. You had a huge increase in the demand for employment guarantee under the
Correct.
National
Rural
Employment Guarantee Act. And so, if anything, that has probably increased.
Yeah.
Edge 2 has
So
probably
the
gone up.
2017 Rajya Sabha question answer,
Okay.
94% is
94%.
Yeah. So
Now-
I've been using that 94%
Now,
figure.
so I think there's been a belated kind of awakening on the part of government about 4 years back when they announced that they would start an annual survey of
Correct.
unincorporated
Yes.
enterprises.
ASUSE, huh.
ASUSE. Has that made a difference to the estimation?
There are a couple of problems there. One is it's not being incorporated into the GDP calculation as yet. So it's the old method that is still being used. That is the benchmark estimate and projection. Now, I have a problem with projections also. If you are using last year's data and projecting it to this year, then that creates a problem because last year was a good year, this year is a shock year. Right? In the shock year, the economy declined, but because you're projecting from last year, therefore the decline would not show up as much, right? And then the next year data, again you project. So again, it shows an overestimate. So these projections are a problem. And unless you change the benchmark estimates and unless you check the high frequency data that you're using, the problem will remain. Second is the high frequency data is mostly from the organized sector. So
Right. Could you
even if-
explain what this high frequency data is? How is it relevant to estimation of the informal?
So when you get the quarterly data, then they tell you that they are using benchmark and moving it with the high frequency data. High frequency data means that data which is available regularly, monthly, quarterly, and so on, right? Because you need to move that benchmark estimate to the current. So therefore you use some proxies.
Right.
These are proxies. Like
what to
airline
come-
travel, like commercial vehicles purchases, freight traffic, and things. But these are mostly organized sector. So this is my other criticism, that if you look at the quarterly 1, quarterly 2 data, they've given a list of the high frequency data, and I'm arguing that most of them are organized sector. So you're using it again with the organized sector data. It's representing the organized sector's growth. Second is that in quarter 1, when this shooting up of the GDP took place, then out of the 22 variables, on 17 there was a decline.
Okay.
So how is it that it suddenly showed a rise? So if you say that you're using some other high frequency data, then give that list. But you're not giving on the basis of the list that was given for the quarter 1 data.
So there's a lack of transparency.
There's lack of transparency. And then for this quarter also, out of 22, 13 are still declining as compared to last year, the same quarter. So again, how do you do it? So what are the other high frequency data, etc., that you're using? So in other words, there's lack of transparency as far as the quarterly data is concerned. Now, then they say, okay, for the annual data, we get more data. But then this method of calculating the quarterly data and then giving the annual series, revised estimate, and so on and so forth, there should be a gap, because this is a different method, that's a different method. But why is there no gap? Or why is there very little gap? There should be a considerable gap in that also. So therefore, they have to come out clean, and that's what the IMF report is flagging, that in February 2026, a new GDP series is going to come out, and a new consumer price index series is going to come out. Okay. Right. Now, we don't know what that will mean, because I think the manner in which the unorganized sector data is to be captured, the proxy variables, the high frequency data, all that will have to be changed. So we'll have to wait to see what comes out of that.
So this base year question is very important for GDP estimations, obviously. Now, I think in the first 50 years after independence, we had, I think, 5 changes in the base year.
Yes.
And the first 15 years of this century, the 1999 to 2014, you had
2004.
You had three different base years being introduced. So that suggests there's a more rapid structural change going on in the economy, does it? Or
yeah.
And so there's a failure to update base year for 14 years is a serious problem.
Yes.
But then once they do it, now the sampling process always uses benchmark, which is the census data, to estimate whether the sampling is representative or not.
Yes.
So census is also delayed. Now, 2027, they're going to probably get the first trickling in the census data.
Absolutely.
So will that mean that the new base year is going to be obsolete just when it's introduced?
So I was going to come to that the next issue with all this is that, lot of the data that's collected by the statistical departments, that is based on the census data. Because that census data tells you the demographic, profile, right. Old people, young people, and different.
Yeah, you need to compare the sample with the universe. Otherwise,
So that is what now. There's been a big change since 2011 when the last census was done. Right, we should have done it in 2021. If not in 21, 22. If not 23, most countries did it in 22, 23. We haven't done it. So this is the other thing that everybody's flagging. That because of the old census data, your surveys are incorrect. Your consumption survey, your employment survey,
correct.
Then your
the samples are not representative.
Samples are not representative, and then this labor family health and this thing survey, NHFS, right. National Health and Family Survey. That data is used to show poverty has declined. Now that's very funny. Because in 2000, it compares 2015-16 NHFS survey with 2019-21. Now, why 1 year and 2 years here? Okay. These 2 years had the pandemic in them, which is not comparable to the earlier thing. And during the pandemic, you saw that incomes decline, so welfare decline. Welfare is one component. Education, students couldn't go to schools and colleges, etc. So education decline. Health decline, you saw people dying in 2020, etc. So how could it be that you had 25 crores coming out of poverty? That using that deprivation data, deprivation data. So there's something very grossly wrong. Because then that survey is extrapolated to 2023-24. Now, the incorrect data on deprivation is being projected further. So that also you're playing around with. So all these surveys which are used for estimating various things in the GDP and so on, those have also turned out to be incorrect. So that's the other problem. That's the added problem that the IMF has not really looked at.
They also removed the director of the National Family Health Survey, right? Because one of the surveys showed that child malnutrition was increasing.
That's right. Yeah.
And they appointed a new person. I don't know if he's produced the results that they want.
No, so manipulation is widespread, in other words.
But what is it in it for them? I mean, is there a political dividend from showing high rates of growth? But then, if it does not reflect on the lives of most people, how does it matter? Is it that, or is it the thing to keep the markets happy? Of
course, the markets are happy because the organized sector is what they're interested in. So the stock market represents only actively traded scripts, say about 1,500. Whereas you have 6,000 large companies, you have 6 lakh small and medium companies, and you have 6.5 crore micro units. So of the universe of about, say, 7 crores, you are proxying with only 1,500 companies which are actively traded in the stock market. And they are the ones to which the government is catering. Okay. But also, apart from that, even the MNCs are interested only in that. So the IMF and World Bank are also interested in the organized sector. They're not interested in the unorganized sector. And the third point is that for political purposes, it's good to show that India is Vishwaguru, that India is the fastest growing large economy. It is good propaganda. See, the poor have been poor for so long. They only, are happy that, maybe we are not doing so well, but the country is doing so well. And you saw that in demonetization year. So the demonetization year, even though everybody saw that poor people suffered enormously, and the rich people went to the back of the bank and they got their money changed. And that's why 99.3% of the all currency came back, even the black came back, right? And yet the people said it's good because the rich were in the same queue as us, whereas no rich was in the same queue as them.
Right.
But the propaganda worked. The UP elections, they did very well soon after the demonetization was done. So in India, this creation of the image is very important. And I think in the world itself also now, creation of an image is very well. Because in the 50s and 60s, you used to have leaders which had a broad vision. Now you have leaders who are photogenic. Whether it's Tony Blair, whether it's Clinton, and so on. This idea that you have to project a positive image, that has become very important. So this giving good data, we have reduced poverty, we are doing this for the country, we are doing that. That is a very good propaganda point for them with the common person.
Providing upbeat data and projecting a photogenic image,
right?
Good for public confidence, at the least. Is that it? But then there are other kinds of anomalies, serious anomalies. Like, for instance, the stock market hit a new high in the last few days. The currency touched a new low.
Yes.
And yet the economy, they claim, is growing at record rates. What do you make out of all this? This very contradictory bundle of signals.
It's the organized sector doing well. That's what the stock market is representing, right? Currency not doing so well is, I think, the effect of Trump and the great uncertainty that he has created. This idea that, there may be a deal with Mr. Trump soon, that boosts the stock market, because with what Trump has done, our trade is suffering, especially the labor intensive sectors are suffering. The unemployment there is going up, So India is diverting its trade through UAE and through the Southeast Asian. So the recent data showed that our trade with UAE has gone up, with Southeast Asian countries has gone up. And that's probably because we are selling in the US market through them. So that the 50% tariff would not apply to them. But what it also means is that the profit margins of the organized sector would be hit, because they'd have to sell to some middle person and then deal with their. So their margins are going to be affected by it. And that's why the labor code has become important, because labor code enables them to squeeze the wages so that their profitability can be maintained, right? So all these things get interlinked.
Right.
And what you are asking is that, the stock market doing well, but the rupee declining. I think there are two different factors that are impacting.
So ultimately, we had a serious curtailment of GST across the board just recently. There could be some revenue loss. Will this affect the fiscal kind of balance, the supposed fiscal balance that they've claimed? And will that have an impact on global confidence? Will that kind of, create some turbulence for the economy?
So this GST cut was announced on 15th August without going through the GST Council. The GST Council is the right body to change the rates. But the Prime Minister announced it soon after this 50% tariff that came on India. And it was expected that that will lead to a lowering of the demand. So they needed to boost the demand. So this GST cut was supposed to enable the demand boost to take place. So even though they made noises saying, no, we were planning for it, etc., but the sudden announcement without going through GST Council meant that it was response to what Trump had done. Now, what is the implication of that? The implication is that the goods produced by the organized sector get cheaper. Automobiles and, your televisions and various other things, right? So the demand for that will go up. But that will mean that the unorganized sector will be further compressed because demand will shift. So if you are eating in a dhaba, you might eat in a restaurant, okay? If you're buying something from the neighborhood market, you might shift to your e-commerce and to the malls because there the things would get cheaper because the organized sector. So my argument is that this GST cut benefits the organized sector at the expense of the unorganized sector because the unorganized sector is not in the GST net. Yeah. So the cut here doesn't affect them. So therefore, actually it will have a negative effect because if the GST cut leads to a further decline in the unorganized sector, unemployment will grow. Because the employment generation in the organized sector is very small. Yeah. It's so automated and so mechanized that it doesn't really generate much. So even though 80% of the investment goes into the organized sector, right? But the proportion of workers in the unorganized sector remains around 94% for a very long time because the organized sector doesn't generate. So my take is that the MNCs will be happy, the big industry will be happy, but for the economy as a whole, probably it will be negative.
So the purpose of the GST is essentially to bring all enterprises into the same value chain, so that everybody can be, can claim the input tax credit and so on. Is that not working in that case?
No, that's working. But you see, the unorganized sector being outside the GST net means it does not get the input credit, right? And therefore, its price does not drop. But the organized sector gets the input credit, so its price drops, right? So in competition for the same item, the price of the organized sector declines, the price of the unorganized sector remains. So there's a demand shift that takes place from the unorganized to the organized sector. And therefore, the demand shift means that the organized sector grows at the expense of the unorganized sector, right? This is what I have been arguing for the last many years. And in my GST book also, I've given this thing about it. And earlier also in EPW also I've written about it. So the point I'm making is that this cut in GST is actually for the organized sector. This is not for the unorganized sector. And the real problem is with the unorganized sector. That's the one that's been declining. That's where the major employment is. And if you hit that again, then again the unorganized sector problem will increase and the unemployment problem will increase.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Arun Kumar. That's been very enlightening.
Thanks a lot.